There's a part of Southbridge nobody talks about. Tucked at the edge of town, where the roads narrow and the woods creep closer, is the old mental hospital. Officially, it's the Southbridge Psychiatric Rehabilitation Center, but everyone calls it the Pines, a name that sticks because it sounds nicer than it is. The Pines doesn't show up in the news. No stories about breakthroughs, no photos of smiling doctors. It's the kind of place people forget exists, even if they live 5 minutes from it. And until last year, I was one of them. I got the job there by accident. It was supposed to be temporary, just a paycheck to cover rent until something better came along. I was hired as a maintenance worker, fixing lights, patching walls, keeping the old building from collapsing in on itself. I didn't ask questions, but I should have. On my first day, the supervisor, a wiry man named Griggs, gave me the tour. "This is the East Wing," he said, gesturing to the long corridor lined with heavy doors. Mostly outpatient cases. Nothing too exciting. We moved on to the common area, then the offices, then the staff quarters. Everywhere we went, it was the same. Peeling paint, flickering lights, the faint smell of mildew. It felt like a relic from another time, a place that should have been condemned years ago. Then we reached the West Wing. Griggs stopped abruptly, his hand resting on the heavy steel door that separated it from the rest of the hospital. "This area's off limits," he said, his tone sharper than before. "We call it the unnamed wing. Don't ask why. Just stay out." I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. "Got it?" I said, pretending not to care. But the way he avoided looking at the door told me more than his words ever could. Over the next few weeks, I settled into the routine. The patients in the East Wing mostly kept to themselves, shuffling from their rooms to the common area and back again. The staff weren't much friendlier, their smiles forced, their eyes tired. But the West Wing, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just the locked doors or Griggs's warning. It was the feeling I got every time I walked past it, the sense that something was watching me from the other side. Sometimes, at night, I'd hear faint noises coming from the wing. Not voices exactly, more like whispers. One night, I was working late, fixing a busted light in the East Wing hallway. The hospital was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I was halfway up the ladder when I heard it. A thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were coming from the West Wing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The door to the West Wing was supposed to be locked at all times. Nobody was supposed to be in there. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I climbed down the ladder, grabbed my flashlight, and crept toward the steel door. The closer I got, the louder the footsteps became. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air felt colder here, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, a single word, whispered, faint, but clear as day. "Help!" I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello!" I called, my voice shaky. No response. I glanced around, half expecting Griggs to appear and yell at me for being where I wasn't supposed to be. But the hallway was empty. I shouldn't have done it, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the keypad next to the door. The code Griggs had used was easy to remember, simple, almost like they didn't care about security. Punched it in, my hands trembling. The lock clicked. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cracked tiles, peeling wallpaper, and something else. Something I couldn't quite make out at first. About 20 feet down the hall, just past the first door, was a smear of something dark on the floor. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the debris scattered across the tiles. It was blood, fresh. My stomach turned, but I kept moving. The first door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted. I pushed it open, the sound echoing down the hallway. Inside was a small, empty room. No furniture, no windows, just a single word scratched into the wall, deep enough to gouge the plaster. "Leave." I stepped back into the hallway, my heart pounding. The whispers started again, louder now, coming from somewhere deeper in the wing. They weren't words, not exactly. Just faint, overlapping murmurs, like a crowd whispering at once. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. The feeling. The same feeling I'd had since my first day. Like I was being watched. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, as if it were listening. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Then it took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, the whispers following me, growing louder with every step. When I reached the steel door, I slammed it shut and punched in the code, my hands trembling. But as the lock clicked into place, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The footsteps. They weren't behind me anymore. They were in the east wing. The footsteps echoed down the east wing, heavy and deliberate, each one louder than the last. I backed away from the steel door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, its shadows twisting with every flicker of the old fluorescent lights. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I took a step forward, my boots crunching softly on the cracked tiles. The sound came from room 14. The door was ajar, its edges splintered as if someone had tried to break out, or in. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The room was dark, the weak beam of my flashlight barely illuminating its contents. At first, it looked empty, just a mattress on the floor, its surface stained and torn. But then I saw them. Words, scratched into the walls in long, jagged letters, covering every inch of the plaster. "He's coming. They lied. Don't trust them." My stomach twisted as I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling. And that's when I saw the corner. A figure sat hunched against the wall, its head bowed, its body wrapped in a tattered hospital gown. My breath caught in my throat. "Hey!" I whispered, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. The gown clung to their thin frame, their hands clutching at something on the floor. A doll. Its face was mangled, its features burned beyond recognition. I reached out, my hand shaking. "Do you need help?" I asked again, louder this time. The figure's head snapped up, their face pale and hollow, their eyes wide and wild. "He's here," they whispered, their voice trembling. "He's here, and you brought him." Before I could respond, they screamed. The sound was raw, guttural, like something being ripped apart. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling from my hand as the figure lunged forward, their fingers clawing at the air. "Get away!" they shrieked. "You don't belong here." I bolted out of the room, grabbing my flashlight as I went. The hallway seemed darker now, the shadows longer, deeper. From somewhere behind me, the whispers returned. They weren't coming from the west wing anymore. They were coming from everywhere. I ran, my boots echoing loudly on the tiles as I headed toward the main lobby. But when I turned the corner, I stopped cold. The door to room 22 was wide open, and the patient inside was standing in the hallway. It was an older man, his face gaunt and lined, his hospital gown hanging loosely from his bony shoulders. He stared at me, his eyes unblinking, his lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said softly. "What?" I stammered, taking a step back. "The door," he said. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The air around him seemed to ripple, the shadows twisting and contorting as he stepped closer. "They'll come for you now," he whispered. "They'll come for all of us." I turned and ran, my chest tight with panic. Behind me, his voice followed, rising in a chant that echoed down the hallway. "Don't look. Don't listen. Don't follow." When I finally reached the security office, Griggs was waiting for me. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing as he slammed the door behind me. Something's wrong," I gasped, my breath coming in short bursts. Griggs stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You went into the West Wing, didn't you?" he said finally. I didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and he ran a hand through his thinning hair. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low. "This place, it's not like the others. The patients here aren't just sick. They're broken." "What does that mean?" I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the monitor bank and pulled up the camera feed for the West Wing. The screen flickered, showing the dark hallway I'd just left. But something was different. The first door was open. The room with the word "Leave" scratched into the wall. Griggs leaned closer, his face pale. "That door hasn't opened in 10 years, he whispered. Before I could respond, the lights in the office flickered. The monitors cut to static, the air growing colder. Griggs grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "What?" I stammered. "Leave. Now." The last thing I saw before I ran was the camera feed flickering back on. The hallway was empty, but in the middle of the floor was a single word, scrawled in blood-red letters. "Run." As I stepped into the hallway, the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping into a deafening roar. And then, from the far end of the corridor, I saw the door to the West Wing. It was wide open, and something was standing just inside. I stood frozen, staring at the open door to the West Wing. It wasn't just open, it was inviting, like it was daring me to step inside. The figure just beyond the doorway didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. The whispers surrounded me again, louder, overlapping into a chaotic murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then, one voice broke through, clear and sharp. "Come closer." My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch its face. It wasn't what I expected. It was Griggs, or at least it looked like him, but his face was wrong. His eyes too wide, his mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong. "You opened it," he said, his voice soft but laced with something dangerous. "You let them out." I stumbled back, slamming into the wall as the lights overhead flickered violently. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The door to the West Wing was still wide open, and from somewhere deep inside, I heard the sound of footsteps. I didn't wait to see who or what they belonged to. I turned and ran, the whispers rising into a deafening roar that followed me down the corridor. When I reached the East Wing, the hallway was chaos. Doors that had been locked earlier were now open, their patients wandering aimlessly, their hospital gowns dragging across the floor. They weren't acting like people. One man stood in the middle of the hallway, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his mouth moving silently. Another patient crouched in the corner, clawing at the wall with their nails, the sound sharp and grating. I passed a woman who was staring into the distance, her hands pressed tightly over her ears. "They're coming," she whispered, rocking back and forth. "They're coming, and we can't stop them." I found Lena, one of the nurses, near the common area. Her uniform was streaked with blood, her hands shaking as she gripped a heavy metal flashlight. "What's happening?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. She didn't look at me. "They're awake," she said simply, her voice hollow. "Who?" Lena finally turned to me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't place. Fear? Despair? Maybe both. "You shouldn't have opened that door," she said, stepping back toward the emergency exit. "You shouldn't have gone in there." Before I could respond, the lights went out completely, plunging the hospital into darkness. The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps approaching from somewhere down the hall. I grabbed Lena's arm. "Wait," I whispered. "Where are you going?" She pulled away, her breath visible in the freezing air. "I'm not staying here," she said, her voice trembling. "Not with them." And then she was gone, disappearing into the dark. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear the faint crunch of glass beneath someone's feet. I backed into the common area, the light from my flashlight flickering weakly against the walls. The patients were gone. All except one. A young boy stood near the center of the room, his hospital gown hanging loosely from his thin frame. He couldn't have been older than 10, his skin pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Hey!" I said softly, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to the far corner of the room. I turned, my flashlight beam catching something on the wall. At first, I thought it was just another scratch, another mark left behind by the patients. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a message, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters. "We never left." The boy's voice cut through the silence. "They're here." I spun around, but the boy was gone. The footsteps returned, heavier now, coming from the hallway. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. In the doorway stood a figure, its body tall and thin, its face hidden in the shadows. It tilted its head slightly, as if it were listening. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The figure stepped forward, its face coming into the light. It was me. The figure standing in the doorway was me. Not just similar, it was me. The same face, the same clothes, but the expression was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched into a thin, humorless smile. "You're not real," I whispered, stepping back. The figure tilted its head, mimicking the way I'd moved earlier. "I'm more real than you," it said, its voice low and distorted, like two people speaking at once. Behind it, the hallway twisted. I don't know how else to describe it. The walls seemed to bend and shift, the tiles rippling like water. The figure stepped closer. "Do you understand what you've done?" it asked, its tone almost amused. "I didn't do anything," I stammered, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The smile widened. "Oh, but you did. You opened the door. You let them out." I turned and ran. The whispers erupted around me, louder than before, a cacophony of voices rising and falling like a tide. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were screaming. I stumbled through the hallway, the walls seeming to close in around me. Doors that had been locked were now open, their rooms empty. The messages on the walls were everywhere now, scratched deep into the plaster. "You'll join them. IT won't stop. You know who we are." The air grew colder with every step, my breath visible as I gasped for air. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not behind me this time, ahead. I skidded to a stop, my flashlight beam shaking as I aimed it down the hall. There was another figure standing there, its back to me. This one wasn't me. It was tall and thin, its shoulders hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I shouted, though my voice barely carried. The figure didn't respond. I took a step forward, my boots crunching on the broken tiles. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure straightened slowly, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. When it turned, my stomach dropped. Its face wasn't human. Its features were stretched, its eyes too large, its mouth too wide, its skin pale and translucent. It grinned at me, a low, wet laugh bubbling from its throat. "You think you can leave?" it rasped. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. "You shouldn't be here," it said, taking a step toward me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and bolted down the hall, the whispers and laughter chasing me. I burst into the staff break room, slamming the door shut behind me. The room was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the vending machine the only sound. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, my mind racing. "What the hell is happening?" I whispered to myself. The break room looked different now. The posters on the walls were gone, replaced by the same jagged messages I'd seen in the halls. The vending machine flickered, the lights inside dimming and flaring in an uneven rhythm. And then I noticed the mirror. It hung on the far wall, its surface cracked and dirty, but something about it drew my attention. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam reflecting weakly off the glass. At first, I saw nothing but my own face, pale and frightened. But as I stared, the reflection changed. My face twisted, the features warping into something unrecognizable. The eyes sank deeper into their sockets. The mouth stretched into an impossible grin. And then it blinked. I froze. It wasn't me. The reflection tilted its head, the way the figure in the hall had. "You can't run," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. When I looked up again, the mirror was empty. The door behind me creaked. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The figure was standing there, its grin wider than ever. "Time's up," it said. Before I could react, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging me into total darkness. And in the silence that followed, I heard the sound of something breathing. Right next to me, the darkness was complete. No flickering lights, no faint hum from the vending machine, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling as I pressed the switch. The weak beam cut through the black, illuminating the break room's scuffed linoleum floor. The air was colder now, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and makes your chest feel tight. Something was wrong. I inched toward the door, every sound amplified in the silence. My boots scuffed against the floor, the sound too loud in the stillness. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, like someone was trying not to be heard. They were coming from the hallway. I froze, holding my breath. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a voice. "You shouldn't be here." I recognized it. Griggs. I yanked the door open, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark hallway. Griggs was standing at the far end, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and strained. "Griggs, what's going on?" I demanded, stepping closer. He shook his head. "You don't get it, do you? This place, it's not what you think." The words hung in the air like a challenge. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice rising. Griggs didn't answer right away. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his movements jittery. "They don't shut this place down because they can't," he said finally. "Too many people with nowhere else to go. Patients the state doesn't want to admit exist." He gestured toward the hallway behind me. "And now you've seen them," he said. "The ones we're supposed to forget about." I turned to follow his gaze, my flashlight beam catching the edges of the open doors lining the corridor. Each room was empty. "You're saying they're dangerous?" I asked, my voice trembling. Griggs laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Dangerous? They're beyond that. They've been locked up here so long. They don't know what the outside world is anymore." A shiver ran down my spine as his words sunk in. "You mean they're loose?" Griggs nodded. "That's what happens when you start poking around in places you shouldn't. You unlocked that wing, didn't you?" I didn't know." "You never do," he snapped. The sound of shuffling footsteps interrupted us. I turned, my flashlight catching movement at the end of the hallway. A patient emerged from one of the open doors, their hospital gown dragging along the floor. It was the boy from the common area, his head bowed, his hands clutching something tightly. "Get back in your room," Griggs shouted, his voice echoing down the hall. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he dropped what he was holding, a small, crumpled photo. Griggs grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the staff exit. "We need to go," he hissed. "What about him?" I asked, gesturing to the boy. Griggs didn't look back. "Forget him. Forget all of this." The door slammed shut behind us as we stepped into the cold night air. Griggs lit a cigarette with shaking hands, his face pale and drawn. "You're done here," he said, his voice flat. I stared at him, my chest tight with anger and fear. "You're just going to leave them? Locked up? Wandering in there?" He took a long drag, his eyes dark. "What do you want me to do? This place has been running on fumes for years. Nobody cares what happens inside those walls. Not the town, not the state, nobody." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about ghosts or curses. It was worse than that. The Pines was a dumping ground for the forgotten. A place where people were abandoned to rot, because no one wanted to deal with them. And now the system that held them in check was falling apart. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Griggs exhaled, the smoke curling in the cold air. Now? He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Now you leave and you don't come back. I didn't argue. As I walked away from the hospital, the weight of the place pressed down on me, the echoes of its halls still ringing in my ears. I didn't look back, but I knew I'd never forget. The scariest thing about the Pines wasn't what I saw. It was what I didn't see, and what might still be hiding inside.